Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Solfate podcast, where we talk with builders in the Solana ecosystem. This was another great one today. We talked with Maddie from Colosseum. Hopefully you guys know who Maddie is because he's been running the hackathons, which are, I think, pretty fucking famous at this point. Like Solana hackathons are a big deal, right, Nick?
They're a huge deal. And yeah, Maddie's been running them at first at the Solana Foundation for like 3 years. And then he left the Solana Foundation to co-found Colosseum, the startup accelerator and hackathon thing that is just clearly going to be a force to be reckoned with. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. They raised a $60 million fund to basically, be able to fund companies that are birthed or through like these hackathons, which is pretty awesome. It's kind of it's almost like a YC model combined with the Solana hackathons from before to sort of make like this really, really awesome accelerator experience where you can prove out teams and ideas during the hackathon and then go through this accelerator to really bring them to market and make them a reality. It's really, really awesome. I'm super bullish on what they're doing. I think it's great.
Yeah. And I'll something to note here is that we talked with Maddie right after, I think, the last hackathon winners were announced. We talked with Maddie, had him on the show. We talked about like, what is the idea of Colosseum? And this episode is just after the completion of the very first accelerator that Colosseum has hosted and like had all these founders go through. And we talked about what it looked like in the accelerator, what they got out of it, some of the lessons learned that the Colosseum and the founders had, and like what it's going to maybe look like in the future. And like we even talked about like some of the fundraising things, like on the fund side of like he raised $60 million, like Colosseum raised $60 million. Like that's no small feat. So we talked about that too.
Not at all. Yeah, it's I think it's a super fascinating conversation, regardless of who you are. But if you're a builder in any capacity who's sort of wondering how to take that next step, I think this is a good one to listen to because Colosseum and its accelerator, I think, is an awesome path forward for anyone who's got a really solid business idea in like the Solana ecosystem. So definitely jump into the show. Before we do that, just want to give a shout out to Phantom. Phantom is the preferred wallet of the Solfate ecosystem. We're thrilled to be partnered with them. Also, just want to say that my dev shop Unboxed is ready and willing to work on all your Solana projects. So hit us up if you need us. With that, let's jump into the show.
Let's go. Nothing in this podcast is or should be considered financial advice. Any opinions and thoughts expressed are solely those of the individual. They do not represent the opinions of any entity. Enjoy. Colosseum just wrapped up the accelerator, which is super exciting. The very first one you guys have done. There were how many teams that were part of it?
There were 10 teams. And all of them were winners in our most recent hackathon, Renaissance, which we ran with the Solana Foundation. So, pretty excited to see those teams get to market in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, ooh, that's so exciting. I've had a chance to talk with a couple of teams, like I just mentioned before we started recording. That I was talking with Sheldon from the Torque team, Sheldon and Larry actually from the Torque team. We're going to record an episode with them next week, which is exciting. And for like a quick refresher for people that aren't familiar, can you give like the elevator pitch of like what Colosseum is, and then what is the accelerator, and like what does that look like for the participants in the accelerator?
Right. For those that haven't heard about Colosseum, it's basically an organization that combines 3 components. 1, online hackathons. So these are global, basically startup competitions where we have people from all regions of the world compete. They usually are building products across the crypto verticals like DeFi, DePIN, gaming, infrastructure. And so we host these a couple times a year for the Solana ecosystem. And then at the end of them, we choose winners. But furthermore, we try to choose the 10 teams that are most likely to make basically a big impact on the ecosystem and actually create like full startups and businesses after the event. And so that's a process in terms of getting those teams to be interviewed and then accepting them into the second component of what Colosseum is, which is an accelerator program. And so that's a 6-week program that we run right after the hackathon with those 10 teams. And the program itself is a little bit different than a traditional accelerator. Again, it's all online, and there's a variety of reasons we can get into why we do that. But it's mostly focused on sort of getting teams in the same sort of shipping cadence that they were in the hackathon. And so we want teams to keep pushing towards getting to sort of a mainnet release, and whatever we need to do to unblock them to get them there is kind of the service that we provide. So that can be connections into the ecosystem on the technical side, non-technical side in terms of like go-to-market and marketing, et cetera, getting them connected with the right mentors. So there's a kind of a stable of mentors who are top founders in the ecosystem, many of whom were former hackathon winners that are basically opened up their time to give advice to these teams. So we have that as part of the program. And then third, which we just got done with, which for our first cohort was our demo day. So fundraising help essentially to round out their seed rounds. And so it's a very condensed program, but if you combine sort of the 6-week hackathon with the 6-week accelerator, the whole sort of Colosseum experience from idea to basically trying to get close to mainnet is 12 weeks. So yeah, that's but that also touches on sort of the third part, which is our venture fund. So we recently closed a $60 million venture fund, and we invest basically pre-seed in every team that goes through our accelerator program. So yeah, that's Colosseum in a nutshell.
Do you guys have like a fixed amount that you invest in the companies that go through the accelerator?
Yes. So we invest $250,000 in each startup. That's just consistent across all of it. So you can think of it as sort of a YC standard deal.
Cool.
We reserve some of the fund though for like follow-on investment. And occasionally we'll do single digit sort of investments that are outside the mandate of just the hackathon. So one of our investments prior to the start of this hackathon was in a project called MetaDAO, which I believe you had profit on recently. So we were their first investors. And so, occasionally we have folks, that are outside of that scope of the hackathon.
Okay, cool. That's cool. Yeah, I didn't realize you guys are doing things outside of the hackathon. Is that the only one that has been outside of the hackathon and the accelerator so far?
Yes, and maybe we'll be the only one, to be honest.
That's fair.
Because basically our model is that the hackathon is sort of our way of obviously bringing top technical founder talent into the ecosystem, but it's also how we sort of evaluate who to underwrite and support as part of our venture fund. So traditional accelerators like a Y Combinator, for instance, they have a different model where they sort of use this college-style university application, right? You have this written application that people fill out, they do the interview, and that's sort of who they decide to invest in. We use the hackathon as sort of the way that we choose who to invest in. And so that's really core to who we support at the end of the day.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that the hackathon versus the college-style submission just seems like a night and day distinction, but two, or I guess B rather, numbers, letters, what they're hard. And B is seems like it's a much stronger signal of someone is dedicated enough to build the thing. They've at least built something enough to win the hackathon, or at least be an honorable mention or above, which takes a good idea, takes good execution, at least to some extent. So it makes so much more sense than doing, submission video. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, that's one of our core theses around Colosseum is just that, what if YC, instead of investing immediately after they accepted teams into their accelerator, what if they waited 2 months to see how well teams kind of shipped and, performed in their accelerator program, and then made a decision on whether to invest or not. And so we're just sort of putting that step first for us. And we think that's a pretty superior model. And I honestly think just even one cohort through, we are thrilled with who we invested in. I think the model is working. So, yeah.
Awesome. One of the things that I think probably most excited to talk with you about today is the accelerator applicants. Like, so all the applicants or all the accelerator teams went through, there's 10 teams, like you said. I'm curious to hear some of the feedback that they've gotten. And because like a lot of it can probably be generalized for the entire Solana ecosystem. So I'm curious if there's like common pitfalls now that you've done this, this accelerator and like gone through this different way of like talking with these companies and evaluating these companies, vice, the years under your belt of running the Solana hackathons and ecosystem. And like, what is some of those insights, and what have people done well? What have these companies done well? And what have they done poorly that, other people can take that info and like for the next round of applicants in hackathon can kind of like just bolster the entire ecosystem, and like a rising tide lifts all ships sort of thing.
Yeah. So the question is more just like what did these teams do to get into the accelerator versus the other teams who participated in the hackathon? Or is it more just like what have we learned about, for this stage of company, what have they done well up to this point, and what can they do better?
The second one.
So the latter. Well, one thing, and we kind of knew this going into it, just because I've been running the hackathons for like 3 or 4 years, but teams really early on have not thought about like legal or sort of entity structure at all. And so that's one of the things though we provide immediately. And in fact, we need it to even make an investment. There needs to be some sort of business entity. So we help most of the teams in in our accelerator sort of get connected to the right lawyers, get an entity set up where they can actually build in earnest, from a legal standpoint. So that's one thing that was pretty clear, which is fine, right? Like, I think in the hackathon, like, you shouldn't be focused on setting up your legal entity. You should be focused on your product and getting at least a dev net. So that's one thing. I think one thing is like making sure, like, we love solo founders, but we also really like teams that are, an actual team. So 2 or 3 folks. I think just even going through the accelerator and going into this sort of fundraising process and, building is that it's really helpful to have just sort of a partner, a sounding board, someone who can, ground you when times are tough, and when times are going well. And so I think we found that, like, if you can find someone to build with in the next hackathon rather than going alone solo, that can be a big help in terms of getting more stuff done in a quicker manner, and also just sort of being an emotional support system as you kind of start a startup, because a startup is a really hard experience, especially in the early days. So those are some things that just initially come to mind when thinking about the teams, but it's tough. I mean, like, teams come in at a little bit different stages. So, like, for instance, we had and Hard had Chad in our first cohort, and he had already released sort of like a beta kind of product, a V1, and had released a token even. So in a sense, like, he was a little bit farther along than maybe you mentioned, like Torque, which was sort of hadn't launched an actual product yet, and then throughout the course of the accelerator got to the point where they have gotten to where they've released a test at least to get some beta users. And so people start also at a little bit different places when they enter the accelerator. But yeah, those are some thoughts just off the top of my head.
I think a lot of people view hackathons as solely a developer experience. One of the things I like about Colosseum is that it's not just about the tech, right? Like, we're accelerating a business. We're trying to start a business. I'm curious, like, how much are you okay with sort of the non-developer functions of a business happening during the accelerator versus before? Or are you screening pretty heavily in sort of that hackathon stage for, hey, these guys have marketing buttoned up, or that they at least have a co-founder who can handle that side of things?
I think it's less about personnel and more just about the quality of the idea going into it. I think this is something that's different than traditional hackathons, is that it's not how many integrations you completed, during the hackathon, or how much code you wrote during the hackathon, which are important. But what's more important is that you started with a viable sort of market and product idea in the first place. And so that's really where the business component comes in. Obviously, the other thing that we look for, that applies to technical and non-technical people, is like early on in the hackathon, we always recommend creating like a Twitter account, right? And starting to like tell people about what you're building, less for, basically marketing your product, but more just about finding like 5 to 10 potential beta users that you can constantly be pinging, being like, hey, here's what we're thinking for our first set of features. What do you think? Just constantly getting in this like weekly process of talking to users. And then throughout the course of the hackathon, actually getting them to use like your DevNet product, test it out through the accelerator, basically be providing feedback all along the way early on, because that's really what early days of a startup are like, is like this constant communication with your early customers and trying to find, that product market fit with, at least 10 people who really love the product. And so this is something that is, I guess not a technical thing. It's more just like a constant communication thing with your core potential users. And so that's something we really look for. I'd say, like there are plenty of non-technical people who join technical teams to help with some of those things. And we have some of those teams actually in our accelerator. But it's oftentimes that it's 2 technical founders, and just one of them, part of their responsibility is more of this non-technical part of the business and thinking more about the business rather than just like building the product. And so, yeah, I think those are some things that teams should think about when entering the competition, if they're doing it in earnest to like start a startup. A lot of people in the hackathon, we still get a fair amount of people, right, who use the hackathon as just like a learning experience, right? They just want to dabble in, getting to hello world on Solana and building a simple project. Or maybe they, don't want to become a startup founder, right? Like being a startup founder is like really, really tough. It's like not a good work-life balance type situation. And so a lot of people just use the hackathon. Yeah. A lot of people in the hackathon just use it almost like it's a resume boost, right? They like built this pretty impressive thing during the course of 6 weeks. There's a bunch of teams that are hiring. They can say, hey, look at my hackathon submission and link to it on Colosseum. And we've heard that a lot too. So it's important to keep in mind, it's not just for startup founders, not just for technical people, it's for non-technical people. But at the end of the day, if you are a non-technical person, if you are a business side of a business and want to co-found a startup, you need to find someone technical before the hackathon starts, because obviously the engineering part is a big part of how we evaluate teams.
Got it. So there is still very much like a premium, if you will, on like the developer aspect here. No one's coming
100%.
through without the tech, just with like a pitch deck and that kind of thing. It's hey, you're gonna build something concrete. Within that, we sort of value those who are thinking about this as a business from the get-go, who are communicating with potential customers or real customers from the get-go.
Correct. Yeah, I think, and the engineering component is really still really important, right? And that's still why we call it a hackathon, right? Is that the way that we evaluate talent is like how did you decide what features to basically prioritize for your first engineering sprint that is basically the hackathon? And then how did you execute on those priorities throughout the 6 weeks? And how far did you get along to an actual like working demo? Because that is the type of team characterization that we want to see as like an early stage venture fund, right? Like this is the type of thing that you look for when you're investing as early as we do, which is pre-seed. And so this is just like a really, really important data point in terms of like how quickly teams ship and how efficient they are from an engineering side. So both are really, really important. But yeah, hopefully that kind of gives you a holistic view of what we look for.
Yeah. Well, it's actually wild to me that there aren't more that this model doesn't exist more in the world, right? Like of sort of coupling a hackathon with an accelerator this way, and saying, hey, we're a venture fund, but we're a venture fund that screens in this fashion. Because to your point, that is the real world work of a startup, is everything you just described. And I also just want to point out, because a lot of our listeners are engineers, and when you say things like, hey, you need to have a viable business idea going into a hackathon, or hey, you need to be talking to users, or potential users, that can sound, I think, daunting for an engineer who's not done that before. But I love that you said you started pretty small with like, hey, you should be talking to 5 or 10 potential users. You weren't like, hey, you need to already figure out marketing and have hundreds or thousands of people on an email list. It was just like, hey, tweet and find 5 or 10 people that you can be doing back and forth with about your product.
Yeah, I'll make it even more maybe palatable for folks. Not only do you have to find just 5 people, oftentimes we recommend, and often the best product ideas and just historically in technology have been solving problems that the founder personally had. And so if you're building this product for yourself, that you could see you be like user number 1 of this on a daily or weekly basis, you just have to find five other people just like you that have the same problem as you do. And so those are sort of very similar people probably to you in a sense, depending on what the product is. And so, yeah, I think, you just start really small. It can be 1 person, it can be 2 people. And then over time though, like that's really kind of where marketing, I think people misunderstand this, especially in crypto, where you see a lot of people using social media to get attention, which is great. Like, I mean, social media is great for that. But in terms of like driving usage of a product and being, very specific with your marketing, is that you want to target a very narrow type of customer that you've already mapped out that has good product market fit with your specific product. And so that starts with a couple people, expands to 10, 1,000, 100,000. If it's a huge market, if the idea is like a really big idea, then it's millions, and you can use more scalable channels. So that's kind of how we think about it and what we advise founders.
And it so depends on what the product is too, right? It's like, if it's a product that you're only able to charge a few dollars a month, it's like, of course, your total addressable market in terms of number of people is going to have to be pretty large. But often the sorts of products that we're talking about in these hackathons might be a more like enterprise level type of thing, where it's like, I look at a company like Helios, for example, which obviously now has many users, but like even then, it's not like, hey, we have the number of users that Facebook has, right? It's like they're targeting companies. So it's more like, hey, can we find people who are willing to pay large amounts because they in turn have lots of users, and we only need 10 or 20 or 100 to reach some level of like profitability at a certain scale. Obviously, at a venture scale, it's like we're going to be targeting higher than that. But I think it's easy to get lost in, like you said, this social media reach, where it's like, I need to get hundreds of thousands of followers, instead of I need to find the few people that really care about the problem I'm solving, and make sure that there's viability there, and then slowly grow from that point. Not necessarily slowly. It can be large.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Ideally fast growth, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing you mentioned, going back a little bit about this being sort of a unique model, I would say it's actually unique somewhat today. Like, no one's really doing this sort of hackathon to venture capital model that I've seen. But if you look at history, there's actually some pretty good examples of this that we sort of modeled Colosseum around, and actually the Solana hackathons generally. So did you know that Napoleon held a like innovation competition like several times? That was just like, come with your ideas, your innovations. We have certain things that we want to see built, but we'll pay you, the French government will pay you this pretty big grant for the best ones. And so there was this like global competition actually. So this is where Alexander Graham Bell actually submitted his idea for basically the telephone. And that's how Bell Labs started, was kind of getting funding out of this program. And so there's
cool.
like things like this. Yeah, there's things like this. There's even like back in the Renaissance, there were patrons, but there were also these kind of groups called guilds that would hold these sort of competitions as well, as like a different model to patronage, where they're like, hey, come, we'll host this event, we'll do this competition, people come with their own ideas, and get funding that way. And so actually I think it's like what we're doing with Colosseum is just a much older idea than actually like traditional venture capital. It just hasn't been implemented in a long time. So that's why we're actually like really excited about this model, because I think it'll become more popular in the future, is what we think.
That's fascinating. I had no idea that it was such like a common thing in the past. I'm now curious to go dig into the history and figure out like when it dropped off. When it's sort of resurged throughout history. That's really cool.
Yeah, another one like maybe more in modern times is like the Nobel Prize, right? So like the inventor of the dynamite, I think Alfred Nobel wanted to see more innovations in the world. That was a lot of the impetus for the first ones. It's obviously arguably been a little bit diluted over time on like what the mission of the Nobel Prizes are. But like initially it was just like, how do we create this sort of competition to award the greatest inventions across these different disciplines, obviously. And so, most people know about the Nobel Prize, but they didn't know all the things that kind of came before it that were a little bit more popular.
I feel like one of the potential issues with these kinds of competitions, and this is a question I want to ask you with Colosseum, is you if you're trying to evaluate a person or a team's ability on producing something over the course of 6 weeks, you obviously want to actually make sure that what they've produced happened in that 6 weeks, or at least know what was before that versus what was during that 6 weeks, so that you can sort of accurately know what their capacity is during that type of time frame. How do you know that? How do you keep tabs on like, was this produced during the 6 week period versus, oh, they've been working on this for 6 months and they just sort of tried to pass it off as something they did during the hackathon?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's not necessarily a perfect science around this, but what we say, this first line of defense is like, let's create a set of like clear rules so that like everyone should be following these. Some people don't, but like the rules are, you can actually have started building your product several months before the start of the hackathon, but you'll just be judged on the work that you do from the start to the end date of the competition. And so how do you figure that out? And it's like, okay, well, you can look at like GitHub commits. Nick has been part of like sort of review squads in the past where we've been looking at like, hey, when did this team, what are we actually evaluating here in terms of the GitHub repo? Because some teams, like for instance, a couple of days before the end of the hackathon, they'll just dump in a ton of code on one day. And you're like, well, were you doing that before?
Single
like,
commit entire repo. Get init commit message done. You're like, I don't think you did all of this in 6 weeks.
Exactly. And so there's ways that we can sort of like get red flags that maybe someone has not been following the rules. Another thing that we've done, so the way that we sort of judge these hackathons, we receive so the last hackathon, we said over 1,000 submissions. We do a couple of rounds of review just on that big pool. It gets it down to a short list. From the short list, there's many different independent sort of groups reviewing that, from external judges to developers, Solana Foundation, Colosseum, etc. But one thing that we do is that once we sort of have like a top 100 projects, we'll actually interview each one before winners are announced or selected, where we kind of, if there are red flags that we're kind of, popping up throughout the process, we'll sort of dig in to those with those teams. Now they can obviously lie on the interview, but it's it's harder to do during a live interview than, just
Totally.
putting in some code in a repo. And so it's not an exact science, but if you're found that you broke the rules and then lied about it, you can never compete in a future hackathon. So there are penalties that we can basically remove people from the platform for doing so, and we've actually done that a couple of times. Yeah, again, not a exact science, but we're trying to improve on catching these things in the future. Maybe AI can help us even more.
You said the buzzword.
Yeah, said the buzzword. But yeah. So, but usually, I mean, like for some of the reviewers like myself who have, I guess, reviewed thousands of projects now, you kind of get a sense of like what people are capable of within that time frame. And from even extreme outliers of the most technical people in Solana to much less than that, you kind of get a sense of what people are capable of. So if you see a full-fledged application on mainnet, that it'll become very clear that this is not something someone built just for the hackathon, which is taken into account.
Yeah, I definitely, I feel like the interview helps a ton. Like I would be shocked if anyone gets through the interview without like you feeling pretty confident that what they did. That being said, doing 100 interviews is a lot. Like that's a lot of interviews. After reviewing like potentially thousands of like GitHub repos, that's intense.
Yeah, I'd say like this is like what keeps me up most at night actually about Colosseum's model is that like literally and and kind of more metaphorically, but like so with traditional venture capital funds, there's sort of this like maybe there's ebbs and flows of your deal flow, right? Of like how often you're talking and making investment decisions about new startups. For Colosseum, it's just like a couple times a year you just get dumped so many talented entrepreneurs, so many talented teams, and you have to sort of make a decision in a very short amount of time, which is actually maybe people think it takes not that long, but it's almost like a month, right? It takes us from when the hackathon ends to when actually winners are announced. And so we're working really, really hard with all these various groups who are reviewing projects over that month. And yeah, adding the interviews adds some time as well, but we feel like we've done a fairly good job of selecting the best overall teams and the teams that have gone on to actually like make a pretty big impact on chain. So while it's not a perfect process and it's a lot of work, we feel like we're evolving the process to get down to the best teams. So that's what really matters.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to
Sure.
we've talked about from the builder founder side, but I'm a little bit curious about the venture side. What was it like raising the $60 million fund for Colosseum? Because that's like something I have zero knowledge of how that works. Like, how does one go about raising a fund, especially one that's so focused on like one particular ecosystem? Like I've listened to a couple of interviews of fund managers and different VCs of how they look at like selecting a fund to put their money into. So I'm curious from the fund raiser perspective, what did that look like for you? And like, what did those conversations look like of basically pitching the idea of what Colosseum is doing? Like, how'd that go? What did it look like?
Yeah. Well, it's a long process and it's very different than like a startup raising venture capital for their business. The differences are one, like the investors are known as LPs. Myself, Clay and Nate, who are my co-founders, we're all general partners. We're active in terms of like actually running the fund. And then we have LPs, limited partners, who are actually like investing in us to carry out the investment thesis. And so finding LPs is a very opaque process. So these people often don't have websites, right? It's like very wealthy families who have family offices around the world, or university endowments, or pension funds, or in our case, sort of all of those things, plus like a long tail of sort of like ecosystem founders or companies that normally don't invest in venture capital, but want to see something like this that would benefit the whole ecosystem get off the ground. And so it took us about almost 10 months from when we started raising to actually closing the fund. So it was a long process to find those right partners, especially the institutional capital took a lot longer. I mean, those conversations took at least 7 months to go from first conversation to actually getting capital in the door. And so, but I mean, it was a grind. No, you know, I don't want to sugarcoat it. And it was also like during a very tough time for crypto and Solana, right? We started sort of in the depths of the bear market. So LPs were worried about the economy generally. So crypto was sort of off the table. And then even something as specific as like building a fund around Solana was just like people had no idea why we were doing that. And so it took a lot of honestly education just to get people up to speed on why we were excited about Solana and why we felt that there was like an unusually high asymmetric upside in that specific ecosystem. And so a lot of conversations were just around Solana, let alone our venture model, which is also sort of unique. And so once people kind of understood why Solana was maybe a good bet, and the ecosystem and startups that were building on it, it was more convincing people. It was like, okay, now we have this, not only is Solana a unique bet, but we also have this layered on this unique sort of model for how we're going to find talent and then ultimately invest in talent and evaluate founders. And so, yeah, it took a while, but we got it done. And so we're pretty excited to be, fully closed with that.
Yeah. I mean, I bet. Can you talk about any specifics of like what types of questions the different like personas of these LPs would like have, and like what was the final thing that like got them over the line? Because like founders in the ecosystem makes total sense. They're already bullish on Solana. That was probably the easiest part of this. But when you have endowment funds and wealthy families that have, trusts and things all around the world, you have universities, like those, I would imagine, have like very different mentalities and like thoughts on especially crypto, but then like, you niche down even further with Solana. I'm curious if you can share anything that like, what were their types of questions and like educating them on Solana? Like, what did that look like? And what was the final thing that like got them over the line to commit?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's important to know that almost all of them didn't commit, right? We probably had over 200 LP conversations that led nowhere. And so the types of LPs and institutions that ended up getting on board, it really came down to someone internally on those investment committees that like really understood what we were trying to do and felt that there was sort of, like I said, an asymmetric upside that the world hadn't caught on to yet, which is a lot of what these investors are looking for. Like, what do we know that no one else really seems to know, but that is potentially true? And so I think, explaining people, obviously, like when, if you haven't been following crypto closely or, you know about Solana just generally, you probably knew that like FTX was somehow interested in Solana during the last bull market. And so when FTX collapsed, people kind of associated, I think at that level, at the LP level, Solana with FTX. And so just the first thing is we would get a lot of questions about that relationship. And once it became clear to them that like, no, FTX is a centralized company that, has been run by these people, there's no relation between what they have done or doing with what's going on in the Solana ecosystem. And not only that, other people, but then they thought, a lot of people must think that there's this relationship that is actually not true. And so just divorcing those two things, I think, was a big thing. I think another thing was that people got pretty excited once we compiled. Obviously, I'd been running these hackathons for 3 years prior to this. And so we were able to have a lot of data basically around how we were running these hackathons, why they were different than traditional hackathons, what the outcomes of some of the teams, the founders who had started in these hackathons, where they were today. And once people kind of got a look at that data, they were pretty blown away, and to look even deeper. And so I think that was sort of the thing, was like, there was obviously an asymmetric upside in Solana, but there was also this sort of novel way of sourcing talent, that we could provide with the data that was interesting to folks. So I think it was a combination of those things, but we got a lot of questions about a lot of stuff. But hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of what people were asking us about.
Yeah, it for sure does. That's interesting.
Yeah, I hope we're doing a little bit of God's work in this front, because I think there has been, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this is there has been a lack of sort of pre-seed funding, specifically in the Solana ecosystem. Even today, there's you compare it to like the EVM ecosystem, there's not as much funding happening, and that's partially because one, a lot of traditional venture funds that are largest funds have started to take more of an interest in Solana, but they still have obviously previous biases around their EVM investments, which are a mini, and maybe other investments that they've made. And so like I think us starting as like sort of a Solana first fund helps just the number of startups that we could invest in quite a bit more, and helping them get and also educating some of these later stage funds on why Solana is interesting. And so that's a role that we play in the ecosystem, not just interfacing with the founders and investing in them, but convincing other VCs at later stages to be interested in what's being built in the Solana ecosystem. So, yeah,
that makes sense.
Again, for like engineers who are listening, where this, the business side here might be new to them. I think one of the things Nick and I try to do with this podcast is encourage people who like maybe want to do something, but they're held back by fears in any one of the verticals that sort of scares them and is nerve-wracking to them. Fundraising, I think, is one of them. And it sounds like, you kind of just said it, as you're sort of paving the way a little bit for these builders to have an easier time of getting fundraising, not just at the pre-seed level, but also like, hey, if you got pre-seed funding, you're probably going to need seed funding and Series A funding. And you're sort of paving the way with these later stage funds to make it so that they're more open to investing in companies on Solana. And more specifically, I think also investing with companies that you've already pre-vetted, basically, right? Where it's like, hey, you went through Colosseum, great. We're starting from a foundation of thinking that you're a solid company. Now let's just make sure that like everything over the last year or so has gone well, and we're in on a seed round, or we're in on a Series A, that kind of thing. So like I love seeing that you guys are here to support that, basically.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, that's why we built the accelerator, right? Is that we had talked to many, even top teams like the Tensors of the world, right? Where they really struggled to go from hackathon winner to raising their first round of capital. And so anything that we can do to help take these like really great teams that are coming out of the hackathon, get them with their legal setup is really important first, and then getting them, the capital that they need, at least enough ramen money to get to the point where they can actually launch a product. And then, thinking about later rounds of financing to really expand once they've sort of found product market fit. And so, accelerate.
Is there any thought to, obviously what you're doing helps the entire ecosystem. Like it helps builders even who don't go through the hackathon or maybe don't make it into the accelerator. Are there any plans to sort of intentionally facilitate something that helps those teams who maybe they're not, they're not the hackathon winners, they don't make it into the accelerator, but I don't know, sort of maybe materials that help, like a self-paced, this is how you go about doing this, even if you're not in the accelerator, that type of thing?
Yeah, for sure. I think, Colosseum is a little bit different, than even traditional accelerators, where because we run the hackathons, it benefits the entire ecosystem beyond just like our selfish reasons for running a venture fund. Like we can only invest in a certain amount of companies. There's a lot of great companies, even in Renaissance, that have gone on to raise like seed funding that we are really happy that they came into the ecosystem to the hackathon, but we didn't benefit it from a fund perspective. So yeah, I think a lot of the content though that we create in our accelerator program, and the mentor session recordings and all of that, we'll probably open source at some point. And so it'll help a lot of teams in the ecosystem who are not just in our accelerator program. So that's one way I think we could scale out our support for a broader group of people. The other thing is just like the Colosseum platform itself. So one thing that we found in the hackathon that we sort of built as an experiment, but I think we're going to double down on in a V2, V3 version of the product, is that we built this sort of like directory where all the developers who sign up for the hackathon, if they're looking for a teammate, they basically get dumped into this sort of directory of profiles, and you can basically search based on interests, what people are interested in, where they're located, all these things that maybe you would want to find in like a co-founder before the hackathon starts. And so we have this section where you can find those core teammates before the hackathon. We found that actually some of even the winners found their co-founders through this portal. And so I think that's another way that we can play sort of a beneficial role in the ecosystem broadly, is sort of building out this product for finding co-founders. Because I think that this a lot comes from my experience in crypto, where when I was getting into crypto, none of my friends or people in my network cared about crypto. And so I had to go to like Bitcoin meetups.
It's like most of us.
Yeah, I think most people are like this, right? They had to go to Bitcoin meetups or Ethereum meetups, or move to San Francisco, or join some Discord groups that you don't know anyone in, and just to find kind of like your people, right? And so if we can kind of create a community specifically around people trying to find like co-founders to launch like on-chain businesses, I think that's another area we can provide a lot of value for the ecosystem broadly.
Yeah, that's actually
cool.
That's actually huge. Finding a co-founder can be incredibly challenging, right?
Yeah.
Because it's when you're like starting a company is like, hey, we're gonna basically live together for the next who knows how many years trying to work on this thing. It's like you spend so much time together, and so it can be really hard to find someone that you feel like fits the bill. So starting with sort of like not vetted in the sense that you've gone through all of these, but that they're in the same community, have the same interests, are here at Colosseum for a similar reason. Like it just narrows down the field so that you can then find someone who's like a good fit.
Yeah. And then the hackathon sort of serves as like, hey, maybe this guy is a good fit. Let's just see how the working relationship functions in the hackathon. And if it works out great, then maybe we should do this full time together. If it doesn't, no worries. We can go on and do our own thing. And so I think, that's kind of where we want to get to, where we have sort of a pretty robust co-founder match platform where people are filling in a lot more information than they do today, where it's like, we wanted people to sort of put in information around like, hey, what are your expectations on like equity split? What's your expectations on like, how often do you work? Some people work on the weekends. Some people expect their co-founders to work on the weekends. Some don't. What are you trying to get out of this, right? Like different co-founders have different sort of motives, right? Beyond just a big amount of money if it works out, right? And so we're going to try to start asking people a lot of those deeper questions, and then sort of serving as more of a matchmaker rather than just like, hey, use this filter to find people to surface up people. Because we're at the point where I think we're over 25,000 developers now on the platform, and so we can. It's hard to look through all those profiles, and so we can serve as more of like, hey, here's 10 profiles this week that we think match your kind of like what you're looking for. And so if we can do that, then there can be a lot more co-founding teams in the hackathon. There's a lot more co-founding teams in the hackathon. There's going to be a lot of new products. If there's more products, there's more competition. If there's more competition, better user experiences for users, more on-chain activity, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the flywheel we're trying to kickstart by this whole co-founder matching piece.
Yeah,
That's
good.
huge.
I like that.
Yeah.
That'd be really cool.
Yeah.
We're getting pretty close to time here. I just have one more question, Maddie.
Sure.
When's the next hackathon?
Yeah. When is this? I don't know when this is going to get released, but we can.
Month-ish.
Okay, great. We'll announce it by then. So the next hackathon is September 2nd through October 8th.
Let's go.
So yeah, it's during the fall. And I think the one unique thing, maybe for those who go to Breakpoint, is we have a pretty special sort of like IRL component, because the hackathon is happening during Breakpoint as well, kind of in the middle. So yeah, look forward to sharing more information about the upcoming hackathon. But yeah,
that's
sick.
Cool. That's awesome.
Amazing.
I'm excited.
Yep. Cool. Awesome,
it's gonna
guys.
be great. Solana puts on amazing hackathons.
Puts on amazing breakpoints.
And now it's you guys, Colosseum, putting on. I mean, it was always you personally, right?
Yeah.
But it's like now it's this separate organization, and I love it. I'm super stoked to see this continue to evolve and watch your guys' success and see how that success impacts the broader Solana ecosystem, the developers who are part of the ecosystem. Thank you for everything that you're doing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, really appreciate everything you guys are doing as well. So thanks for having me on, and we'll be in touch.
All right, good stuff.
Cool.
To all the listeners, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for being here.
Bye-bye.